Hello and welcome to this special uh, on the channel. This is for All Saints Day. I know it's a few days late, but things happened and I wasn't able to go live. I did want to do my commentary videos that I've been doing, but again, things happened. But hopefully next Tuesday I will be going live again, or sometime I'll be going live. I may actually go live tomorrow, but don't hold me on that. Now, I wanted to do this, as I said, on All Saints Day. I wanted to commemorate All Saints Day, All Hallows Tide, as it usually was known as, by reading about some of the saints. I have a book here called Illustrated Lives of the Saints, and it has biographies of, I think there's about 107 saints in this book. Some of the more popular saints, and I wanted to read the biographies here and show you the images they've got in the book. Usually for each saint, they have a short biography, an image, a biography, the day of the feast of the saint in the calendar of the church. Some of them, it tells you what their names mean and also what they are the patron saint of, which is interesting. So I wanted to commemorate All Saints Day by reading some of these saints' biographies, especially for my Catholic viewers, so that you all know some of these saints at least. I wanted to commemorate All Saints Day by reading some of these saints' biographies, especially for my Catholic viewers, so that you all know some of these saints at least, and it sort of gives All Saints Day a bit of a meaning, because we talk about the saints and it's a sort of generic word, and we don't really know a lot of these saints. I mean, some of the saints that I've read about, there's so many of them that you don't hear about all of them, obviously. Usually we just stick to the more traditional saints that we've sort of been accustomed to honor and venerate and pray to since we were children. But anyway, so these saints are in alphabetical order. Some of these you may know, some you may not know. I certainly didn't know all of the saints in here. I knew most of them, but it's quite nice to have books like these, so you actually have an idea of who these people were, and you get to see through their biographies what sort of a people they were when they were alive, and you can sort of relate to them, especially if you find a saint that lived a similar life to you. I mean, I've read about saints who were housewives who were married to abusive husbands, and they got beaten by their husbands. And then you read that and you think that's very powerful, especially to, let's say, a woman, certainly a Catholic woman, who's got an abusive husband. You may know someone like that, and you may say, well, there's a saint that can perhaps provide you a model, become a model in their lives. So that's why I wanted to read these out, so we've got like an idea of who these men and women are that we venerate as saints, and give them an image and an actual personality, instead of just saying generically the saints. We see the pictures of the men and the women with halos around their head, like St. Basil behind me here with his halo. But when we actually see that these people actually have real lives to them and real personalities, and we read about who they were and what they did in their lives, we begin to realize that actually they're not as all mystical as we think they are. They were real people with real situations. Some of them went through martyrdom, as some of these saints in here went through martyrdom, terrible persecutions, and they provide for us models. The whole reason why we venerate saints as Catholics is because, first of all, they are our family. They are part of the communion of the church. Even though they're not alive on earth, they are with God. So they are more alive than we are, actually, because they're with God. They cheer us on. Saint Paul says, we're sort of in an arena, and we're in the middle of the arena fighting against the lions, and the saints are in the stands cheering us on. They represent for us, of course, models of how to be Christian. They are living signs that Christ fulfilled his promise in them, that he said, if you will love me, keep my commandments. If you want to enter into heaven, keep my commandments. They did those things. They did the works that God commands of them. And they reveal to us the work of God in them, that God proved his promise through them, and the grace of God that was with them and that was in them, the Holy Spirit moving them in their lives and working with them and through them. Many of these saints, even when they were alive, performed miracles because God was working through them. And of course, when we venerate saints, we're doing it because we recognize the work of God in the saint. We're not praising the saint just because of the saint's sake. We're praising the saint because of what God has done to them. We're basically saying, we thank God for what he's done through you. Especially, of course, when you find a saint that lived a similar life to you, and you take that saint on as a patron. And when you begin to study that particular saint and you begin to read about them, you begin to realize that that saint represents you in an effect. That saint suffered the same type of problems that you suffered, and yet they're in heaven. How do they get to heaven? You read about them and you see how God worked in them. And then what do? First of all, you ask God to give you the same graces that he gave that particular saint. And second of all, you ask the saint themselves to pray for you, because they know what it was like to live in that situation. Again, going back to the abusive wife. If you know someone who's got a husband who's abusive, and you say to that woman, there's a saint for you because there's this saint, whoever it is, who got abused by their husband, why don't you pray to this saint and ask for them to help you and become a patron in your life, someone you can turn to as a model, and to ask God through the saint, to give you the graces that God gave the saints themselves. And so we venerate the saints because of God, because God made them into a saint. He worked through them, and his grace was trying to find the word here. The grace of God, the Holy Spirit and the grace of God worked in them as the principal mover of their good works. And so that's one of the brilliant things about when you read, certainly if you read some deep theologies, how the grace of God, how God gives you grace to do good works. So it is God himself who is doing the good works through you. But then when you've completed the good works, God rewards you for doing that work with more grace, even though it's technically him who's doing the good work through you. So strange how that works. But anyway, as I said, these saints provide us as models of Christian life. And of course, it's very easy to look at, the images and the statues and stained glass windows of saints, and they're often depicted in a very sanctified manner. They've got halos on their heads, which symbolizes the crown of eternity, the crown of life. That, for example, in the Apocalypse of St. John, the 24 elders who throw their crowns on the floor. That's what the halo represents. It represents the crowns that they're given. We often look at these saints as, being very mystical and otherworldly, and we forget that they were real people and still are real people who on earth had problems that they had to suffer through. They had hardships, persecutions of whatever kind. And oftentimes, we look at their pictures and we look at their statues and we look at their iconography, and we, in a way, sometimes we rob them of the humanity they have. And so we have to remember, that these were real people. And that's why we take them as models in our lives. And that's why we should have patrons. We should have particular saints that we can relate to, because they are with our Lord in heaven. And because they're with our Lord in heaven, they are perfectly united to the will of God. Therefore, they cannot do anything against the will of God. And so therefore, when they pray for us, they're doing exactly what the will of God is commanding them to do, which is to intercede for their brothers on earth. because of course they want us to get to heaven to be with them. That's the whole point. We intercede for one another. So I want to go to the saints here, and just start out with, as I said, they're in alphabetical order, and just read the biographies, and certainly for my Catholic viewers, to let you know when the feast day is of these particular saints, and also what they are the patron saint of. And as again, this book is called The Illustrated Lives of the Saints. So if you want to find this book online and purchase it yourself, I'm pretty sure that any Catholic bookstore would have this. EWTN, if you know what that is, the Eternal Word television network that I've bought several things from, they most likely will have this. I'm guessing they tend to have everything. It's actually quite a nice little book because it's perfect for children because of the images in here. I mean, the biographies are quite short. The images are perfect for children. And of course, certainly for children, they really do need saints to model on, especially in today's day and age. If you can find saints in here that represent chastity and purity and the perfect virtues of the Christian life, that's perfect for children and of course teenagers and young adults. So the first saint in the book here is Saint Agatha, and this is her image there. I hope that's coming up on the camera. Yeah, that's Saint Agatha. Okay. And it says, Saint Agatha was born in Sicily, the beautiful daughter of wealthy parents. At an early age, she consecrated herself to God. Agatha lived during the time when Christians were persecuted for their faith. Because of her beauty and her wealth, she was pursued by the governor of Sicily, Quintianus. She rejected his proposals, and he had her arrested, charged as a Christian, and sent to go live in a house of prostitution where he hoped she would be forced to change her life. Imagine that today. Imagine if you've got a young woman who has a marriage proposal and she says no. So the guy has her thrown into prison or thrown into a house of prostitution. She prayed and wept and remained faithful to God despite the humiliation she suffered and the assaults she endured. Agatha miraculously maintained her virginity, and after a month, Quintianus had her thrown in prison where she continued to profess her Christian faith. To torture her, he had her stretched and burned with torches, and finally, get this, finally had her breasts cut off. Bit extreme, isn't it? Thrown back into prison to die, Agatha was comforted by a vision of St. Peter the Apostle, who healed her of all her wounds. After 4 days, she was taken back to Quintianus, who was not the least bit impressed by her miraculous cures. He ordered her to be rolled over hot coals and glass and returned to prison. Again, that's rather nice. You're trying to woo this woman, and the way you do it is not by serenading her and giving her flowers and chocolates. No, let's just throw her into a brothel and then cut off her breasts and burn her and then put her over a hot coal and glass, because that's really going to make her want to fall in love with you. With this final prayer, quote, Lord, my Creator, you have always protected me from the cradle. You have taken me from the love of the world and given me patience to suffer. Receive my soul. Saint Agatha died. Rather a beautiful biography there. She endured persecution. Now, her feast day is on the 5th of February, so it's only a few months away. And she's the patron saint of bell ringers, bakers, nurses, wet nurses, and martyrs. And she's also the patron saint against breast cancer and against fire. So if you know someone who's got breast cancer, a lot of women seem to have breast cancer these days, perhaps Saint Agatha might be the saint they might want to pray to. Okay, our next saint here is Saint Agnes. And here's her picture. Another beautiful saint. I hope that came up all right on the camera. St. Agnes was but 12 years old when she was led to the altar of the goddess Minerva at Rome and commanded to obey the persecuting laws of the Emperor Diocletian by offering incense to the goddess. In the midst of the idolatrous rites, she raised her hands to Christ, her divine spouse, and made the sign of the life-giving cross. Now remember, she's 12 years old. She did not shrink when she was bound hand and foot, though the chains slipped from her young hands, and the heathens who stood around her were moved to tears. The bonds were not needed for her, and she hastened gladly to the place of her torture. Remember, she's 12. Next, when the judge saw that pain had no effect on her, he inflicted an insult worse than death. Her clothes were stripped off, and she had to stand in the street before a pagan crowd. Yet even this did not daunt her. Christ, she said, will guard his own. And so it was. Christ showed by a miracle the value which he sets upon the custody of the eyes. While the crowd turned their eyes away from the spouse of Christ, as she stood exposed to the view of the pagans in the street, there was one young man who dared to gaze at the innocent child with immodest eyes. A flash of light struck him blind, and his companions took him away half dead with pain and terror. Lastly, her fidelity to Christ was proven by flattery and offers of marriage. But she said, Christ is my spouse. He chose me first, and his I will be. At length the sentence of death was passed. For a moment she stood in prayer, and then bowed her neck to the sword. With one stroke her head was severed from her body, and the angels carried her soul to paradise. Now, St. Agnes's feast day is on the 21st of January, and she's the patron saint of chastity, of young girls, Girl Scouts, engaged couples, and rape victims. So certainly if you've got young teenage girls or even just younger girls than that, you may want to offer St. Agnes as a possible saint for them to imitate. So that is St. Agnes. Okay, our next saint here is St. Aloysius Gonzaga. It comes up all right. St. Aloysius Gonzaga there. Aloysius was born in Castiglione, Italy in 1591. His father was a military officer and expected his sons to train in military exercises and join in court life. When he was 8, Aloysius and his brother were sent to study and to serve in the court of Francesco de' Medici. At the age of 12, a kidney disease kept Aloysius in his room, where he took the time to pray and to read the lives of the saints. He returned to Castiglione and met Cardinal Charles Borromeo, who, by the way, is also a saint, and gave him his first Holy Communion. He read books about the Jesuits and longed to become a missionary. He practiced by teaching catechism, fasting, and rising in the night to pray. In 1581, his family moved to Spain, where Aloysius and his brother Rodolfo became pages in the court of King Philip II. He remained pure despite the temptations surrounding him, keeping his eyes down and never looking at women. He had decided to join a religious order. His mother agreed, but his father was outraged. They returned to Italy, where several members of his family tried to persuade Aloysius to forget about the priesthood, but in 1585, he gave up all rights to his inheritance, went to Rome, and joined the Jesuits. You have to remember, at this time, the Jesuits are a new order, so a lot of the priests at the time were becoming Jesuits. Aloysius had a difficult time accepting the new rules set by the Jesuits. He was made to eat more and exercise with the other students and pray only during certain times of the day. When a plague broke out in Rome in 1591, the Jesuits opened a hospital and Aloysius volunteered to work there. It wasn't long before he caught the disease, and although he recovered, his health was never the same. He told his confessor, Robert Bellarmine, who is also a saint and one of my patrons, of a vision he'd had showing that he would die in the octave of the Feast of Corpus Christi. Now, back then, the Feast of Corpus Christi, the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ, actually, back then it was just the Feast of the Body of Christ because the precious blood had its own feast. But Corpus Christi had an octave back then, So 8 days of continual celebration of the feast. On that day, on the octave day, he seemed well, but requested the sacraments of the sick and the prayers of the dying, which Cardinal Bellarmine administered. Aloysius died on the 21st of June, 1591, just before midnight. And he was canonized in 1726 by Pope Benedict XIII. And St. Aloysius' feast day is June the 21st, the day of his death, and he's the patron saint of young students. So you may want to offer him, especially if you've got male students, and especially if you've got, a son or a brother or some young man in your family who's going forward for the priesthood. Right, our next saint is Saint Alphonsus Marie Liguori, another well-known saint. Alphonsus Mary Antony was born in 1696 in Marianella, near Naples, Italy. One of 7 children, he was the son of a Neapolitan nobleman and a devout Catholic. He attended the University of Naples at 16 and began practicing law by the age of 19. Despite his success as a lawyer and against his father's will, Alphonsus left his practice as a lawyer to become a priest. He was ordained in 1726 and began work with the homeless youth in Naples, opening evening chapels as centers of prayer, community, and education. Several years later, he went to live at the Chifley College, where he began training missionaries. During a retreat at the college, Alphonsus met Sister Mary Celeste, who told him of a vision she had that he was the one chosen to start the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, known as the Redemptorists. The order was dedicated to preach and teach in the slums of the cities to the most abandoned souls. And indeed, he did actually found the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, known, of course, as the Redemptorists. We actually have some priests who visit us when my parish priest is away, and the supply priests are from the Redemptorists. In 1762, Alphonsus was appointed Bishop of St. Agata dei Goti. During this time, he taught theology and wrote, tended to the poor and instructed those in need, reorganized the seminary and other religious institutions. Rheumatism deformed his body and he struggled physically. And in fact, if you see pictures of him like the picture here, you'll notice that his head is sort of bent forward because the rheumatism sort of bent his spine, so he couldn't lift his neck up. St. Alphonsus died in 1787 and was canonized in 1839 by Pope Gregory XVI. He was proclaimed a Doctor of the Church by Pope Blessed Pius IX. His works include The Glories of Mary, which I actually have a copy, The Practice of the Love of Jesus Christ, and the Visits to the Most Holy Sacrament, and they have had a great impact on Catholics throughout the years. The feast of St. Alphonsus is the 1st of August, and he's the patron saint of confessors, theologians, and moralists. So if you're studying theology, he's the perfect saint for you. Right, our next saint is St. Ambrose of Milan. St. Ambrose was born in Trier around the year 339. After his father died, he moved to Rome with his mother and later moved to Milan with his brother. He studied and practiced law and was appointed governor of Liguria and Emilia, living in Milan. The Arians and the Catholics were in a constant state of chaos, and upon the need of appointing a new bishop, tension arose and Ambrose was called on for help. Now, just to clarify who the Arians were. The Arians were heretics. They followed a man called Arius, who was a priest from Alexandria in Egypt. And Arius taught that Jesus wasn't God. So basically, he was like the ancient version of a Jehovah's Witness, essentially. The Arians denied that Jesus was divine, They also denied the Holy Trinity was a person. Um, Certainly that the Holy Trinity, they denied the Holy Spirit was God and was a person, and of course they denied the existence of the Holy Trinity. And the Arian heresy was condemned by the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea that was convened in 325. As Ambrose addressed the people, someone in the crowd yelled, "Ambrose for bishop." The crowd, both sides, began to chant for Ambrose, who had not even been baptized but was still a catechumen. Catechumen, of course, are those being instructed in the Catholic faith before baptism. Within a week, Ambrose was baptized, consecrated Bishop of Milan, and began formal instruction. He studied scripture and the early church fathers. Now, if you think that's rather quick, baptized and made a bishop, that's how things used to work in the early days. You read about some of the early popes. You may have a layman who was elected pope, and so they would ordain him a priest one day, and then make him a bishop, the bishop of Rome or the pope the next day. Sometimes you'd have someone who wasn't even baptized; they'd be baptized, then they'd be made a priest, and then they'd be made pope. Like within successive days. Things worked differently in the ancient church. For example, the Pope was elected by the people of Rome, by the clergy and the people of Rome. They would gather and actually elect the Pope, like in actual elections. So now, of course, it's just confined to the cardinals, but back then it was the people who, elected as well. St. Ambrose gave all his money to the poor and all his land to the church. He opened his door and allowed himself to be available to anyone in need of confession, guidance, or leadership. He fasted regularly, prayed continually, offered Mass daily, and preached discourses that would later give him the title of Doctor of the Church. Now, for those who may not know, for whatever reason, the title of Doctor of the Church, the word doctor is the old Latin word for teacher. It doesn't mean doctor as in a medical doctor, it means a teacher. And the title Doctor of the Church is awarded by the Pope to certain eminent teachers of the faith in the past who, through their writings, have expressed basically the teacherhood, whatever you want to call it, doctorhood, doctorship, whatever you want to call it, in the faith. So I can't remember. I've got a book actually in my bookshelf that's got a list of the biography of each of the doctors of the church, but there are some female doctors. Most of them are male, but from the 1970s onwards, I think there was three or four women who've been made doctors of the church. But it basically is a title of eminence for certain saints who've taught well in the church, and so the church gives them the title of Doctor of the Church. Ambrose was called on time after time by different Roman emperors to help in political struggles. By 385, he had defeated Arianism in Milan and stopped the use of churches as havens for the Arians. Ambrose also counseled the Emperor Theodosius after the emperor's massacre of thousands of men, women, and children, and subjected the emperor to a public penance where he grieved for his mistake. So a bit about this. The Emperor Theodosius went and took his army, or part of his army, to, I think it was the town of Thessalonica in Greece, because there was some public rioting or something. And he basically ended up slaughtering the entire town. When he returned to Milan, because he was living at Milan at the time, the imperial court was at Milan, he tried to enter the cathedral at Milan, and Ambrose said, you murdered all these people. And just move the camera down a bit. Ambrose banned the emperor from entering the church and said to the emperor, I'm not going to allow you to receive Holy Communion for the next 3 years until you've done public penance. 3 years. Imagine that today. Imagine if you've got a pro-abortion politician and the bishop says, you're not going to receive communion until you give up your abortion views, or after they have, say, well, because you supported the mass murder of children, well, certainly it is technically a mass murder. Well, you're going to do public penance for at least a year. And some of these penances were quite strict. Like you had to say X amount of prayers a day, sometimes as many as 15. You had to fast on bread and water X amount of times a week. Some of them were like you had to be publicly flogged. Literally you'd kneel in the middle of the town square or even in the middle of the church, and you'd have monks whipping you or something. Perhaps they should return that back for sexually abusive priests. That used to be the penance in the old days for sexually abusive clerics. Before they were chucked out of the priesthood, they would be publicly beaten. Ambrose was the first to address church-state relations and to stress the supremacy of the church in regards to morality and the church herself. St. Ambrose died on Good Friday, the 4th of April, in the year 397. The feast day of St. Ambrose is the 7th of December, so just literally almost a month away. And he's the patron saint of bishops, of learning, and of candle makers. I don't know where that comes into his life, but he is. So that is St. Ambrose of Milan. The next saint is St. Andrew the Apostle. Okay. St. Andrew was one of the fishermen of Bethsaida and brother, perhaps the elder brother, of St. Peter, and became a disciple of St. John the Baptist. When called by Christ on the banks of the Jordan, his first thought was to go in search of his brother, and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," and brought Peter to Jesus. It was he, again, who, when Christ wished to feed the 5,000 in the desert, pointed out the little boy with the 5 loaves and the fishes. St. Andrew went forth with his mission to plant the faith in Scythia and Greece, and at the end of his years of toil, to win a martyr's crown. After suffering a cruel scourging at Patre in Achaia, now Achaia is the what we now say the southern half of Greece. It was the Roman province of southern Greece. St. Andrew was left bound by cords to die upon a cross. Now, St. Andrew died upon an X-shaped cross, as it shows you in the image there. He died on an X-shaped cross, and that's why the flag of Scotland is an X-shaped cross, because of course St. Andrew is the patron saint of Scotland, and he died on an X-shaped cross. When St. Andrew first caught sight of the cross on which he was to die, he greeted the precious wood with joy, saying, "O good cross, made beautiful by the limbs of Christ, so long desired, now so happily found, receive me into your arms and present me to my Master, that he who redeemed me through you may now accept me from you." For 2 days, St. Andrew remained hanging on this cross alive, preaching with outstretched arms from this chair of truth to all who came near, and asking them not to hinder his suffering. The feast day of St. Andrew the Apostle is the 30th of November, so the end of this month. And indeed, it's a solemnity, of course, in Scotland, St. Andrew's Day. And also, there's a novena that begins on his feast day. It's called the St. Andrew's Novena, but it's actually not to St. Andrew. It's an Advent novena because, of course, Advent usually begins around about the end of November. This year, Advent begins on the 2nd of December, so not long after, of course, St. Andrew's feast. And the St. Andrew's Novena is a short novena that you say 15 times a day from St. Andrew's Day up until Christmas Eve. 15 times a day. I've not endeavored to pray it because I'd never be able to. Ordinary novenas can be quite, I often forget to pray them, so 15 times a day is a bit, at the moment, is far beyond my capacity. St. Andrew is the patron saint of fishermen, sailors, against gout, neck problems, and of course is the patron saint of Scotland. Our next saint here is Saint Anne, who is another well-known saint. I'm trying to cultivate a devotion to her for various reasons. Saint Anne was the spouse of Saint Joachim and was chosen by God to be the mother of the Blessed Virgin Mary. They were both of the royal house of David, and their lives were wholly occupied in prayer and good works. One thing only was missing from their marriage: they were childless. And this was held as a bitter misfortune among the Jews, because the Jews thought that if you were barren, it meant God hated you, quite literally. After a long wait, when Anne was an older woman, now the way it happened was St. Anne prayed to our Lord to give her a child, and she promised that whatever sex the child was, she would give the child back to God. Well, her prayer was answered, and she gave birth to our Blessed Lady. And she eventually presented to Our Lady to the temple, and the Blessed Mother became uh, effectively a nun for her early life. She lived in the temple with the other temple virgins, and that's why our Blessed Mother is why we refer to her as ever virgin. And our Blessed Mother took that vow of perpetual virginity because it was from the time when she was in the temple. She effectively lived as a nun. After a long wait, when Anne was an older woman, Mary was born, the fruit of grace than of nature, and the child more of God than of man. With the birth of Mary, the aged Anne began a new life. She watched her every movement with reverent tenderness, and felt herself sanctified by the presence of her immaculate child. But she had promised her daughter to God. To God, Mary had consecrated herself again, and to him, to God, Anne and Joachim led Mary up the temple steps, saw her pass by herself into the inner sanctuary, and then saw her no more. They literally did not see their daughter again after that. Thus was Anne left childless in her lone old age, and deprived of her purest earthly joy just when she needed it most. She humbly adored the divine will and began again to watch and pray until God called her to unending rest with the Father and the spouse of Mary in the home of Mary's child Jesus. Now, St. Anne's feast day is July the 26th, together with St. Joachim, and she's the patron saint of grandmothers, mothers, housewives, housekeepers, and women in labor. And St. Anne, of course, she's well known as a very powerful patroness in the church. Many people pray to her. I've started a devotion to her to ask her to help me with, chores in the house, like, just sweeping the floors and stuff. I ask her to help me because I try to offer up all my, house chores and stuff as a penance for my sins. And I asked St. Anne to help me with that because she was a housewife. I need a woman's touch. So that's St. Anne. Our next saint here is St. Anthony the Great, or St. Anthony the Abbot. He goes by many names. This is not, of course, St. Anthony of Padua. That's a different Anthony. This is Anthony the Great. Anthony was born in 251 in Egypt. His parents died when Anthony was about 20 years old and left him with a wealthy landowner with only one sister in his care. After attending church one day and hearing the gospel message of St. Matthew, if you seek perfection, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, Anthony sold all he had, put his sister in a convent, thanks for that, and went outside the village to live like a hermit. I quite like that. He just put his sister in a convent. He wore animal skins, ate bread and water, and prayed constantly. With people coming to him for prayer and advice and healing, Anthony decided to move to the tombs farther from the village. He fought with the devil on several occasions, and once, when the local villagers came to bring him food, they found him physically beaten and left for dead. They cared for him, and when he recovered, Anthony moved farther out into the desert. He lived in a type of cell for 20 years, taking food and giving advice through only a small crack. Finally, a group of villagers went and broke down the door, worried about his physical well-being, and found him in amazing health. Many around him were healed, and those who stayed with him formed one of the first monasteries, living separately as hermits except to hear Anthony speak. Again, more people came for advice and healing, pulling him from his life of extreme prayer and service to God. He left and went to a desert oasis where he spent the rest of his life praying, fasting, and weaving mats. Although he left no formal monasteries, he was a great example of living an ascetic life. St. Anthony died in the year 356 at the age of 105. Now, St. Anthony is known as being the father of monasticism and the father of the eremitical life, because he basically began the life of hermits and monks. Need to take a sip here. Ah, nice and refreshing and cool, that is. Now, the feast day of St. Anthony is the 17th of January, and he's the patron saint of basket weavers, grave diggers, graveyards, and hermits. So if you know anyone who's in the profession of basket weaving or grave digging or being a hermit, there's your saint to go to. Our next saint is St. Anthony Mary Claret or Claret, depending on which way you want to pronounce it. I have to say that image of him is not quite all that flattering. There is actually a better image online, but beggars can't be choosers. Anthony Mary Claret was born at Salent in Catalonia, Spain in 1807. He trained to be a weaver, the trade of his father, and went to Barcelona to specialize. While there, he used his spare time for studying. He returned to Catalonia and entered the seminary at Vic in 1829. On the feast of St. Anthony of Padua, the 13th of June, in 1835, he was ordained and assigned to his home parish. Anthony traveled and preached and gave retreats. He founded a great religious library, the Libraria Claret, or Claret, or Libraria, however you pronounce that, or the Library of Claret, I think is, or Claret, depending on how you pronounce it, in Barcelona, and wrote over 150 books. Certainly liked his writing, didn't he? In 1849, he founded the Missionary Sons of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, known as the Claretians. At the request of Queen Isabella II, Anthony was made Archbishop of Santiago in Cuba. He reorganized seminaries, built hospitals and schools, validated thousands of marriages, and gave local missions. He traveled, and the more he preached, the greater the number of attempts on his life. After 7 years, he was called back to Spain and became the confessor to Queen Isabella II. He disapproved of the happenings in the court, but it allowed him to continue to preach, to write, to establish libraries and schools, and to help revive the Catalan language. He took the opportunity to help in the appointments of bishops and other religious leaders in Spain. In 1869, he left for Rome to participate in the First Vatican Council. His poor health forced him to retire to the Cistercian Abbey at Fontfroid in southern France. He died in 1870. And the feast day of St. Anthony Mary Claret is the 24th of October, and he's the patron saint of weavers, of the Catholic press, and of the Missionary Sons of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the order that he founded. Okay, another saint now, St. Anthony of Padua, who is a very well-known saint and is one of my patron saints. My middle name is actually Anthony. I'm sort of named after him. He's one of my patron saints. And in fact, in my parish church, we actually have a statue of him on one side of the sanctuary, and there's like a candle stand in front of it so you can light up candles. He's one of my, I've got a statue of him. I've got some prayer books to him, and also I've got his chaplet, and I try to honor him every Monday, but I try to pray his chaplet, but I never get around to doing it. I always promise and I never do. It's like, no wonder St. Anthony doesn't hear my prayer sometimes. He's probably offended. And of course, St. Anthony helps you find things. And in fact, not long ago, he helped me find a pin that fell on the floor over there. So he helped me find that. In 1221, St. Francis of Assisi held a general meeting at Assisi. When the others dispersed, there lingered behind, unknown and neglected, a poor Portuguese friar, resolved to ask for and to refuse nothing. 9 months later, the eldest son of St. Francis, as St. Anthony was known, stood revealed in all his sanctity, learning, and eloquence before his astonished brethren. Devoted from his earliest youth to prayer and study among the canons regular, Ferdinand de Bouillon's as his name was in the world, that was St. Anthony Padua's actual name. His actual name was Ferdinand. He had been stirred by the spirit and example of the first 5 Franciscan martyrs to put on their habit and preach the faith to the Moors in Africa. So Anthony became a Franciscan, and inspired by their martyrdom, he went to preach the faith to the Muslims in Africa. One night, when St. Anthony was staying with a friend in the city of Padua, in Italy, his host saw brilliant rays streaming under the door of the saint's room, and on looking through the keyhole, he beheld a little child of marvelous beauty standing upon a book, which lay open upon the table and clinging with both arms around Anthony's neck. Now, that's obviously that's Jesus, of course, and that's why St. Anthony is depicted holding the infant Jesus. By the way, the white lily there symbolizes St. Anthony's purity. With ineffable sweetness, he watched the tender caresses of the saint and his wondrous visitor. At last, the child vanished, and St. Anthony, opening the door, ordered his friend, by the love of Jesus, whom he had seen, to tell the vision to no man, as long as he was alive. Suddenly, in 1231, our saint's brief apostolate was closed, and the voices of children were heard crying along the streets of Padua, "Our father, St. Anthony, is dead." The following year, in Rome, one of its sons was inscribed among the saints of God. So that's the brief biography of St. Anthony of Padua. Now, his feast is the 13th of June, which is exactly a month after my birthday. And he's, of course, the patron saint of lost items, oppressed people, and he's the patron saint against starvation, and also the patron saint of amputees. I can't remember why that is. You often find that some of these saints tend to be patrons of things that you wouldn't necessarily associate them, but there we go. St. Anthony of Padua, the eldest son of St. Francis. Next, we have Saint Apollonia. Apollonia was a virgin and a martyr who lived in Alexandria in Egypt during the persecution of Decius from 248 to 249. That was when the persecution took place. She was a holy woman who spent her life taking care of others and performing acts of charity. During the reign of the Roman Emperor Philip the Arab, Christians suffered cruel tortures at the hands of heathen mobs that pillaged homes and put many to death. Apollonia was seized by a group of men who punched her repeatedly in the face, crushing all of her teeth. The men then gathered sticks together in a pile outside the city and threatened to burn her at the stake if she did not deny her beliefs in Christ. Like many of the Christians of the time, Apollonia suffered the decision to voluntarily take her life or denounce her faith or lose her virginity. Early Christian martyrs often had to choose an untimely death to hold fast to their beliefs. As St. Augustine said, although they quitted life in this way, nevertheless they receive high honor as martyrs in the Catholic Church, and their feasts are observed with great ceremony. This is a matter on which I dare not pass judgment lightly. Before the men gathered around Apollonia so they could torture her further, she plunged herself into the fire and was burnt to death as a symbol of her refusal to deny her faith. Dionysius, the bishop of Alexandria, knew all too well the sufferings of the Christians of the time and confirms in a letter to another bishop the true strength of these people during the persecution. Now, I believe actually, it doesn't mention it here, that Saint Apollonia actually had her teeth ripped out at one point, because she's depicted with a pair of pincers with a tooth in the pincers, because I believe she actually had her teeth ripped out. Anyway, Saint Apollonia's feast day is on the 9th of February, and of course she's the patron saint of dentists and of toothache. So if you have a dentist appointment coming up, or if you've got toothache right now, or whenever you do get toothache, she's the saint to pray to. Our next saint here is Saint Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, the great church father, whose icon I actually have over there, so he's always watching me. Saint Augustine was born in 354 at Thagaste, a provincial Roman city in northern Africa. Although his mother, Saint Monica, raised him in the faith, he left the church to follow the Manichaean religion. Now, for those who may not know, the Manichaeans followed the teaching of uh, I think his name was Mani or Manicus. He was the Manichaean faith, or the Manichaean religion. That it was a heresy. It was essentially extreme Gnosticism. So the Gnostics were these ancient heretics, and I think um, they're not mentioned by name, but they are sort of described in the New Testament. They were an ancient early heresy. Actually, they're still around today, the Gnostic idea. But they taught that there were two gods. The good God, the God of the New Testament, who was the God who created the spirit world and the souls of men. And then there was an evil God, the God of the Old Testament, who created the material world. And they taught that the evil God created the material world in order to trap the souls and the spirits of the good God. Well, the way that we escaped our physical bodies, because they taught that matter was evil, which is a heresy, they taught that the way to escape the body is to release the soul. And the way you did that in the Gnostic idea was through acquiring occult knowledge, through mystical practices, and through chants. So it was basically Eastern mysticism, like the Buddhists who sit on the floor and they go, Om, it was basically like that. And you sort of read some of these texts that the Gnostics had, and they had these weird chants in sort of like the middle of their texts. Now, the Manichaeans sort of took that a bit to the extreme. And eventually in the 1200s, you have the Albigensians who then take it to another extreme. And the Albigensians, for example, they taught that that procreation was bad, that marriage was bad, and the highest act of religion to free the soul from the body for the Albigensians, who were just extreme Manichaeists, their highest act of religion was to commit suicide by starvation. So you begin to realize that these people weren't all that terribly well. And St. Augustine actually followed them. He actually became a Manichaeistic heretic himself in his early days. I don't think it mentions it here, but St. Augustine also in his youth, it does actually say it in here, but he was sexually promiscuous in his youth. Augustine went on to Carthage and became a master in rhetoric and philosophy. Augustine took a mistress with whom he had a son, whom he named Adeodatus. In 383, he went to Italy to teach in Rome, but instead moved to Milan, where he met St. Ambrose, who I've not long talked about. After reading an account of the life of St. Anthony the Great, who I've also just read about, Augustine underwent a profound conversion. With the influence of St. Ambrose, and with the prayers of his mother, St. Monica, and the friendship of St. Alypius, Augustine converted to Christianity, quitting his teaching position and devoting his entire life to God. Ambrose baptized Augustine and his son, Adeodatus, on the Easter Vigil in 387 in Milan. The Easter Vigil, of course, is the evening before Easter Sunday. The beginning of Easter is with the Easter Vigil, and of course, even today, as we know in the Catholic Church, it is customary that converts to Catholicism, if they haven't already done so, are baptized at the Easter Vigil. Upon the death of his mother, Augustine returned to North Africa after spending time in Italy, writing and praying. In 388, he sold all that he had and created a monastic foundation at Tabast. He was appointed a priest in the town of Hippo Regius, and his popularity spread as a famous preacher. In 395, he was made a coadjutor bishop of Hippo and occupied the see for 34 years as bishop. He was constantly writing and preaching against the heresies of the time. During the 18-month siege of Hippo by the Vandals, who were a German tribe, Augustine spent much of his last days in prayer. He died in 430. He wrote many books, including his Confessions and City of God. And of course, St. Augustine is well known as the Doctor of Grace. He is a doctor of the Church, a Western father of the church and one of the most distinguished theologians in the history of the church. And in fact, he founded a religious order which are now known as the Canons Regular of St. Augustine. His feast day is the 28th of August, and he's the patron saint of brewers. I don't know where that comes from, probably from his early days of getting drunk. Theologians, the city of Carthage, and of printers, probably because of his writing. And he's also, I have to say, a good patron, a good saint to pray to if you've got problems with purity or chastity, because he was sexually promiscuous in his early life. Okay, our next saint is Saint Barbara. Saint Barbara was brought up a pagan. A tyrannical father, Dioscorus, had kept her jealously secluded in a lonely tower, which he'd built for the purpose of keeping her confined. That sounds so Rapunzel, doesn't it? You know, maybe that's where Rapunzel comes from. Maybe it's the legend of Saint Barbara. Here, in her forced solitude, she gave herself to prayer and studying and contrived to receive instruction and baptism in secret from a Christian priest. While in the tower, she convinced some workmen who were building 2 windows to add a third in honor of the Trinity. Dioscorus, on discovering his daughter's conversion, was beside himself with rage. He himself denounced her before the civil tribunal. Barbara was horribly tortured and at last was beheaded, her own father, merciless to the last, acting as her executioner. Well, that's quite nice, isn't it? God, however, speedily punished her persecutors. While her soul was being carried by angels to paradise, a flash of lightning struck her father, and he was rushed before the judgment seat of God. And of course, I expect we know where he ended up. His daughter is off to heaven to become a saint, and he's going down to hell to become a member of the damned. The feast of St. Barbara is the 4th of December, and she's the patron saint of miners, architects, builders, brass workers, stone workers, artillerymen, and she's also the patron saint against lightning and storms. So if you're an architect, a miner, a builder, a brass worker, a stone worker, or artilleryman, she's probably the woman you want to turn to for help. Our next saint here is Saint Benedict, another well-known saint. I have his image over there. When I say over there, I mean my altar. I've got an altar here, and I've got a wall with all these different icons on, and one of them is Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict was born of a noble Italian family about the year 480. As a young boy, he was sent to Rome and placed in the public schools. He was turned off by the lack of discipline and the laziness of the Roman youth, so he fled to the desert mountains of Subiaco, and lived as a hermit for 3 years in a deep cave. Legend has it that he was brought food by a raven flying to the cave. That's rather weird, you know. Imagine a teenager today going to school and saying, "Oh, I'm bored with this. I'm turned off by the lack of discipline and the laziness of the youth here, so I'm just going to go and disappear to the desert and live in a cave." But sounds rather extreme, but you know, extreme situations ask for extreme measures. He lived there unknown in his cave, except by the monk Romanus, who clothed him in a monastic habit. His example of prayer and sanctity soon attracted others to join him. The strictness of his rule also caused others to despise him, and one even poisoned his drink. But when Benedict made the sign of the cross on the bowl, it broke and fell into pieces on the ground. After he built 12 monasteries in the mountains, he moved to Monte Cassino, where he founded an abbey and wrote his rule, known as the Regula Sancti Benedicti, or the Rule of St. Benedict, and lived there until he died. He had the ability to read consciences, to prophesy, and to stop attacks of the devil. He destroyed pagan temples and idols and drove demons out from pagan sacred sites. At one point, there were over 40,000 monasteries guided by the rule of St. Benedict, and his motto was Ora et labora, pray and work. And of course, St. Benedict's, you can go and read his rule online. The Benedictines are a well known monastic order. They're the ones that usually dress in black. And St. Benedict's rule is they often say that Christian Catholics should adapt parts of St. Benedict's rule to their lives. I mean, you can actually do it. You can adapt certain of his his rule to your private life, such as praying at certain times of the day, and fasting and penance, and also his motto Ora et labora, pray and work. Um, and of course it's St. Benedict who sort of gave us the divine office that we have today, and sort of set the hours, because his monks were praying at certain hours of the day, and the church has adopted that and said, we'll extend that to the rest of the church. Now, the feast day of St. Benedict is the 11th of July, and he's the patron saint against witchcraft, temptations, poisoning, kidney disease, fever, and he's also the patron saint of dying people, monks, and of school children. Now, I actually have a novena book of prayers to St. Benedict, and I also have the chaplet to St. Benedict. And another one, a good thing of St. Benedict is to have his medal. You get a medal and get it blessed by a priest. It's a powerful sacramental against the devil. Not a talisman, but it is sacramental, because St. Benedict, as it says, was well known for fending off the devil. And so he's a powerful saint against the devil. Our next saint here is Saint Bernadette of Saint Bernadette Soubirous. Bernadette Soubirous was born in a humble home in southern France on January the 7th, 1844. As a child, her health and her parents' poverty forced them to send her away to live with friends. But to prepare for First Holy Communion, her mother insisted she return home. Soon after, while gathering wood at Lourdes, Bernadette first saw the vision of Our Lady in the grotto. 17 times again, the frail little girl beheld the wonderful vision. She saw the Mother of God for the last time on earth on July the 16th, 1858. 8 years later, while great numbers of pilgrims continued to visit the grotto, the bishop eventually pronounced the visions authentic. Bernadette then entered the convent and became a sister of charity. Her death in 1879 ended a life of illness and pain. 30 years later, as church authorities investigated her claim to sainthood, her body was exhumed and found perfectly preserved. From the center of Christendom, St. Peter's in Rome, amidst majestic ceremonies of canonization, Pope Pius XI, on the 8th of December 1933, the feast of the Immaculate Conception, proclaimed Saint Bernadette to the world as a saint. Now, it's rather interesting because my parish church is called the Church of Our Lady of Lourdes, and outside the church, in front of the presbytery, there is, next to the drive, there's a grotto that has a statue of Our Blessed Mother in the grotto, and then St. Bernadette, and there's a pond and flowers. And there's also ashes buried. Ashes of some of the parishioners are buried in the grotto, and also the ashes of one of the deacons in our parish who died several years ago. Some of his ashes are buried in the grotto. Now, the feast day of Saint Bernadette is the 16th of April, and she's the patron saint of illness, poverty, and of Lourdes in France. And of course, Lourdes is a big pilgrimage site for Catholics. One of the things, when our Blessed Mother appeared to Saint Bernadette, one of the things she did was she caused a spring to come out the ground, and now it's a pool. And people, of course, as we know as Catholics, take their sick to Lourdes, and they bathe them in the water, and there's been many miracles. Because my parish is named after Our Lady of Lourdes, the school children in our parish school, go on pilgrimages to Lourdes, and you see all these sick people when you go there, just people in wheelchairs and on beds and everything, and they sometimes even put them in the water. Some people drink the water, I think, and there've been many miracles, over the years, over the last 100 and whatever years. There've been many miracles of people being cured. Now, I'm conscious that I'm sort of over an hour. I don't want to go on too long here, so I may, after a few more, I may sort of stop this and do a part two later on, because I'm actually doing this. It's almost 9 p.m. and I haven't had my dinner yet. So I stupidly had a snack a few hours ago, so that unfortunately filled me. So, but I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to read a few more, maybe a couple more, and then I'll probably get to the end of um, of the saints whose names begins with B, which is 1, 2, 3 more. I think I'll do 3 more, and then I'll wrap this up as part 1, I suppose, and carry on perhaps tomorrow, because it's Sunday tomorrow. So it's a good, nice day to talk about the saints, and perhaps do the rest. I didn't realize it would take this long, and there's over 100 saints in this book, so maybe there's going to be a part 3 as well. Right, our next saint is St. Blaise. Hope that's coming up all right. St. Blaise. St. Blaise lived in the 4th century and was the bishop of the city of Sebeст, which is in the country of Armenia. That's modern-day Turkey. He was also a physician who healed people and animals, and according to legend, the sick animals would come to him for help, but would never disturb him while he was praying. The church was being prosecuted in those days, so Blaise lived in a cave in the mountains. One day, a group of hunters seeking wild animals for the amphitheater came upon Blaise's cave. They were first surprised and then frightened to see the bishop kneeling in prayer, surrounded by wolves, lions, and bears. As the hunters dragged Blaise off to prison for being a Christian, a mother approached him with her young son, who had a fish bone stuck in his throat. At the saint's command, the child was able to cough up the bone and was cured. The governor of Cappadocia tried to persuade Blaise to worship the pagan idols. The first time he refused, he was beaten. The next time, he was hung from a tree and his flesh was torn with iron combs. He was finally beheaded and became a martyr of the church. The feast day of St. Blaise is the 3rd of February, and he's the patron saint of healthy throats, builders, construction workers, veterinarians, and of animals. And the image there of the bishop holding the 2 candles at the child's throat. On St. Blaise's day, the 3rd of February, it is traditional for priests to bless the throats of laymen. And there's a special candle, and it's an X-shaped, 2 candles in an X shape. And you put the candle actually at the throat. You light the candles up and put them at the throat of the person, and you bless their throats. We do that in my parish here on St. Blaise's day after the morning mass. On St. Blaise's day, the throats of the parishioners there are blessed with the candles and whatnot. So we do have a throat blessing on his day. Our next saint here is Saint Bonaventure. Now, Bonaventure is Latin. Bonaventura means good venture, good traveling. Like, what's the word now? The French word. I can't remember what it's called now. Bon voyage. That's it. Thank you, my angel. Bon voyage comes from the Latin bonaventura, which means good journey or good venture. His name was Giovanni, but Giovanni di uh, Fidanza was born around 1221 at I'm not even going to pronounce that. Um, Bagnoregio, I think it's pronounced Bagnoregio in Tuscany. Forgive me if I'm butchering this with my Italian. I don't speak Italian. Um, his name was changed to Bonaventure after he was healed from a serious sickness through the intercession of Saint Francis, who cried out, "O buona ventura," which translates "O good fortune," or that's basically what it means. Saint Bonaventure entered the Franciscan order to become a Franciscan and went to Paris to study. Um, he later taught scripture and theology at the Franciscan school in Paris until he was appointed Master General of the Franciscans in 1257. He worked hard to reorganize and reform the order. Although numbers increased, he still had a difficult time finding a middle ground between the rigorists who put poverty above everything and the moderates who wished the severities of the rule to be relaxed. He was different from St. Francis in that he put great importance on study, which required buildings and books. He viewed their mission as preaching and giving spiritual direction, which directly complemented the work of the parish priests who were not prepared in that area. In 1273, Pope Gregory X appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Albano. When the messengers came with the news, Bonaventure had them wait outside until he finished washing the dishes. He was summoned to Rome to speak at the Council of Lyons in an attempt to help repair division between the churches of the East and the West. He died on the 15th of July, 1274, before the council ended. He was canonized by another Franciscan, Pope Sixtus IV, in 1484. His multiple writings, valuable commentaries, and lectures ranked him as one of the great doctors of the Church. And his feast day is on the 15th of July, the day of his death, and he's the patron saint of workers. And our last saint is Saint Bridget, another female saint. Bridget was born around 452 in Ireland. Her father was a pagan chieftain and her mother his slave. Her mother was sent away and sold, but after Bridget was old enough, she was returned to her father and put in charge of the dairy. Bridget was known for her generosity to the poor and the needy. Stories are told of her giving away flour and milk and even her father's jewel-encrusted sword. Once old enough and freed from slavery, Bridget was sought after for marriage, but she'd vowed to enter the religious life. It is said that she asked God to make her undesirable, and her face became disfigured until she made her vows, at which time her face recovered its beauty. She and several other women were consecrated to the religious life by St. Mel the bishop. In the 470s, Bridget founded the Kildare Abbey, known as the Church of the Oaks, on the plains of Sildara. Forgive me if I butcher that. I don't speak, although my parish is predominantly Irish, I don't speak Irish. I don't speak Gaelic, I should say. This small oratory developed into a cathedral city supporting a double monastery, one for women and one for men. From this monastery, a center for religion and learning, Irish missionaries were sent to preach and to teach, therefore contributing to the spread of Christianity throughout the country. Bridget traveled extensively and founded many convents. She founded a school for art, which specialized in metalwork and illumination. Her scriptorium produced the Book of Kildare. Known for her wisdom and her generosity, stories of miracles surround the life of Bridget, and she died around the year 524. And the feast of Saint Bridget is the 1st of February, and of course I think St. Bridget is one of the patrons of Ireland, along with St. Patrick, and she's the patron saint of babies, blacksmiths, chicken farmers. So if you've got chickens, she's your woman to go to. Children whose parents are not married, dairy workers, island, midwives, the poor, printers, scholars, and travelers. And I'm going to sort of call it there. So I've gone through the saints of A and B. I didn't realize it'd take me about an hour, but so those are some of the saints thus far. I hope at least one person's found a saint that they can turn to. So I think tomorrow, because of it being Sunday, I will come back and do part 2, and hopefully we won't have to go into part 3, but we'll wait and see what happens. But I'll certainly try and do it again tomorrow when I come back from Mass. I could try it before Mass, but I don't know. I have to wait and see. Because Mass, the Mass I go to, the Mass I go to is the 11 o'clock Mass. So anyway, I should have mentioned at the beginning of this, if you hear any sort of banging in the background, that's because we've got fireworks going on, because Monday, the 5th of November, is here in England bonfire night, or Guy Fawkes night, and the customary thing is to have fireworks and bonfires. But because it's the weekend before bonfire night, they're all having it off. They're having their fireworks off now, mostly because, of course, the children, because it's the weekend. And I expect they'll be doing the same tomorrow as well. And it usually goes on for I know sometimes it goes on for like 1 o'clock in the morning. They're still having fireworks. They actually had some last night, and I went to bed early because I had to go to Mass this morning. And to serve at Mass because the regular people weren't there, so I served at Mass. And so last night I went to bed early. I went to bed like, actually, what time did I go to bed? I think it was about 10 o'clock. It might have even been 9:30. But I was really tired. I've noticed that I've been really tired because the clocks have gone back an hour because of it going into wintertime. Our clocks have gone back, and my body hasn't adapted to it. So, like right now, it's just after 9 p.m., but my body thinks it's after 10. So I'm starting to feel a bit really tired. But I've got to go and cook my dinner, which will probably take me about half an hour or so to do. Well, actually, slightly more than half an hour. And then I'm going to chomp my way through it. I'm having my lovely Southern fried chicken, which I really like, and watching Supernatural, because I like watching that program, even though I get really cheesed off at the bad theology they have, but I like watching it. Anyway, so forgive me if you've heard, bangs in the background. As I said, I went to bed early last night because of going to Mass this morning, and the fireworks were going off, and I turned over because my bed is sort of parallel to my window, and I turned over, and there was a big flash and then a big massive bang, and I jumped literally almost out of bed because of the fireworks. Bloody hell. And of course I had one of my windows open because it got a bit stuffy in here, and it was the loud bang that went off, and I saw the red flash on the wall, on the opposite wall, and then bang, and of course I jumped out of bed like I saw a ghost. So yes, you get it. Yeah, there's a bit of my biography there. I'm telling you my biography now, just in case I become a saint. So yeah. So thank you for joining me here. I'm not sure. There's no one watching at the moment. I did see one person pop on. There's no one in the chat, and it said that the chat disconnected and then reconnected. So as of recording this, no one's watching me at the moment. No one's liked at the moment, and there's no one in the chat. So whoever comes afterwards, thank you for joining me. And hopefully you'll join me live, hopefully tomorrow. Although most of my viewers tend to be from America, and of course the time zone difference, and I think your times are changing this weekend, if they haven't already. So the time zone difference, the time zones is can be a bit awkward. If I do a video before I go to Mass tomorrow morning, most of you probably will be in bed, so you probably won't see, you won't watch it live. Anyway, I need to go and have my dinner now. So, uh, actually, what am I gonna have? Mm. Oh, I'm gonna have my waffles. Yes, I'm gonna have some nice potato waffles with my chicken. Now, I've got a choice: southern fried chicken wings, southern fried chicken legs, or drumsticks, or southern fried poppers, or whatever they're called, popsters, or whatever they're called. Hmm. It's gonna be chicken because that's what I seem to eat lately is just chicken. It's really nice. It's starting to become next to pork, it's becoming my favorite meat. Anyway, enough of my daily life here. This is not a vlog about me, it's about the saints. But technically I am a saint. The legend's a saint, so I'm technically am a saint. Can you see my halo yet? Um, but yes, I shall do part 2 tomorrow, and I'm not sure how long I'll go on for, but there's still quite a lot of saints to go through. I mean, what page did I go up to? Page 40, and I'm not sure how many saints I went through. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 18. So 18 saints in an hour and a half, essentially. Oh, great. Yeah, I'm going to be here forever, aren't I? And there's over 100 saints in here. Maybe I should just done one quick video, just like one saint a day. Mind you, it'd take me 100 days, wouldn't it? Anyway, I'm definitely going to go now and have my dinner. And then hopefully tomorrow, some of you may join me. But hopefully some of you will see this. Hopefully it'll come up. Maybe you didn't get the notifications. I don't know. Because I know that I don't get notifications anymore about people going live. Well, actually, I do. I do get notifications, but not all the time. But anyway, I am going now. So thank you for joining. I hope this has been educational, certainly for some of you. At least one person's found it educational. It's quite nice to read through those biographies to know about the saints. And as I said, this is a bit late because I was going to do it on All Saints Day, but never got around to doing it. But anyway, it's my little tribute to the saints. So hopefully you'll all join me for part 2 tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then Monday, but I'm hoping to go tomorrow. So thank you for joining me. God bless. And hope to see you live tomorrow. So God bless for now.